Why get all your holiday decorations delivered through Instacart? Because maybe you only bought 2 wreaths but have 12 windows. Or maybe your toddler got very eager with the advent calendar. Or maybe the inflatable snowman didn't make it through the snowstorm. Or maybe the twinkle lights aren't twinkling. Whatever the reason, this season, Instacart's here for hosts and their whole holiday haul. Get decorations from the Home Depot, CVS, and more through Instacart and enjoy free delivery on your first 3 orders. Service fees and terms apply.
Hi, everybody. Sharyl Attkisson here. I hope you enjoy this special From the Archives edition of Full Measure After Hours.
Hi, everybody. Sharyl Attkisson here. Welcome to another edition of Full Measure After Hours. You know, Cuba is America's closest adversary in terms of sheer proximity. Today, a visit to the communist island nation to hear their government's view of the long-standing U.S. embargo, how it really came about, Cuba's relationship with China, threats to the U.S., and what happens next. Sunday, November 19th is my cover story on Cuba post-Castro and the rocky relationship between Cuba and the U.S. and what it's done to Cuba and the Cuban people. Why is it we still have an embargo against Cuba that cripples the communist island and the people who live there? Why do they get the tough treatment that we don't give to communist China or communist Vietnam, even after Castro is long gone from Cuba? In today's podcast, you're going to get to hear the modern Cuban government viewpoint from Fernando de Cossio, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs. I begin by asking him what's his understanding of what the U.S. says would have to change in Cuba for the embargo to be lifted or for there to be a different economic relationship. Here is Fernando de Cossio.
The U.S. has had a change in goalposts during the years. Many years ago, it was our presence in Africa and solidarity with the peoples of Africa. Then that we supported countries in Central America. At another moment that we had a relationship with the Soviet Union that doesn't exist. It has been changing the goalpost. Then because we didn't have enough internet. Then because we didn't have enough of a private sector. So they changed the goalpost. The real aim seems to be a failure by powerful groups in the United States to accept or to understand that Cuba is and has the right to be an independent country. And there's an aim to control our economy.
Can you explain that in sort of a summarized version, prior to the change and the revolution and so on, Cuba was almost a satellite of the United States for a time. Is that accurate?
Yes, we were a neo-colony of the United States. They owned most of the land, most of the wealth, most of the utilities. They had the capacity to put and take out whichever government they existed. And they were the ones who legitimized if a government could exist or perform in Cuba.
What time period did it change where the Cuban people decided to make it where they weren't really such a satellite of the United States, but more independent?
There was a growing spirit or motivation by the population to change that reality. But at the end of the 50s, and there was a dictator called Fulgencio Batista put in place by the U.S. that dramatized things. It made it critical, and that led to a rebellion that introduced a new government set to transform the reality of the country.
Is it fair to say you think that the United States was dramatically impacted by the change in Cuba? Because a lot of private companies had a lot of business going on here, and as a result, the companies were shut down and operations were totally changed.
The commitment to achieve full independence, to regain the wealth of the country, to ensure social justice for the population, led us to redistribute wealth and to redistribute property in the country. Inevitably, it put us in a collision course with the U.S., not because of design, but because the United States was owner of most of the wealth in the country, including the casinos, hotels, and other facilities that were owned by the mob in the United States. And that put us in a collision course.
It seemed to me over the years, a lot of discussion was over Fidel Castro and the Castros. But are the Castros entirely gone from government now?
Fidel Castro passed away 7 years ago, but he has been out of the government for 17 years, since 2006. And Raul Castro, who replaced him, is not president since 2018, and he doesn't even lead the party since 2021. So even though Raul Castro is recognized as a leading figure in the country, he doesn't have a role in the government beyond being a legislator, but he has no active role in the thing. So the excuse of the United States that the Fidel Castro first and the Castros in pro were the obstacle for the relationship, again, has been proven to be pretext, because they're not in government anymore, and they continue to have the same kind of economic warfare against Cuba.
What do you suspect, if you don't think the true reasons or the reasons given, what do you suspect are the true reasons the United States has the policies that it does?
An aim to control the fate and the destination of Cuba. And as I said at the beginning, the failure to recognize that we have the right to have our own government in the way we feel, and to carry out a system of economy and policy which ensures social justice, which we call socialism. We don't do it against the United States. We do it for the benefit of the people of Cuba.
Do you see any merit to the argument that in the United States there may be concern with Cuba so very close to our shores that Cuba has close relationships with countries that are considered adversaries, such as Russia and China?
There's no evidence to prove that. The U.S. government, the people in the government have raised it, but there's no evidence of any hostile or offensive activity by either Russia, China, or any country that the United States would think is an adversary against the United States. The United States would have it. They would have taken action on it. It hasn't occurred. But it serves as an excuse for those that do not want any progress in the bilateral relationship.
Can you explain how the Soviet relationship came to be when the United States relationship changed?
It began when the U.S. said that they would not buy Cuban sugar anymore. We didn't know where to sell it. It was the only crop that Cuba could export. And the Soviets says, we'll buy it. So we sold it. Then the U.S. refused to sell oil. And the Soviets said, we'll sell you oil. Then the U.S. companies said, we won't refine. The refineries that owned by the U.S. in Cuba refused to refine Soviet oil. We said, okay, we'll intervene then. And Soviets came to help. So it was a relationship that helped Cuba at a moment where we had nowhere to turn. And they expressed a lot of solidarity with our country at the time, and they became quite a good partner. And that lasted during the Soviet Union. And that kind of relationship ended in 1990 with the former Soviet Union.
How do you suspect Cuba would look today if not for the embargo?
That's what we would like to see. The U.S. embargo, or U.S. blockade, as we call it, is today the main hurdle that we need to overcome for our development and for the progress of our country. In spite of it existing, with an overwhelming impact for the past 60 years, Cuba has been able to excel in areas that other countries haven't, in terms of scientific development, transformation of the economy, well-being of the population, even though Cubans, anyone who would visit the country, would know that we live a very modest life, that our infrastructure needs a lot of investment in it, that we have lots of problems with our economy. But I would put to a test. Allow the U.S. to lift the embargo for just 2 years. Just 2 years, and measure what Cuba can be done. In 2015 and 16, the Obama government introduced very limited exceptions to the U.S. economic blockade. And nobody would argue that at the time the Cuban economy flourished, that private investment began to grow, activity in the country, that the standard of living of the population grew. And that was just 2 years with very, very limited exceptions. So I would put that to a test.
So you started to touch on it, but can you describe the relationship with Cuba under Obama, Trump, and Biden?
At the end of his administration, the Obama government introduced changes. The most important one was that it formalized diplomatic relations that continue to exist today. The Trump government didn't change that. But then introduced very mild exceptions in the overwhelming economic embargo that had a positive impact, and also progressed in the area of cooperation of areas of mutual interest. The Trump administration set back those exceptions, reduced the level of dialogue between the two countries, and practically shut down any cooperation between the two governments. The Biden administration has continued to apply the economic measures of Donald Trump. In other words, it has not reintroduced the exceptions of the Obama government. I would say that it has rather applied with a lot of loyalty the measures taken by the Trump government, but it has reintroduced a level of diplomatic dialogue and the channels of communication, which are important, and restored some of the areas of cooperation. Basically migration, which is of interest to both countries, law enforcement, environment, including terrorism, which is paradoxical because the United States has Cuba in the list of countries that allegedly sponsor terrorism.
When did that go into effect?
It went into effect 11 days before the Trump administration left the government. It refused the pressure. It resisted the pressure to do so until the end. But the one that has been applying the impact and the consequences of being in that list is a Democratic government, even though it shouted very loudly when Trump reintroduced us in that list.
Does Cuba support terrorist states or terrorist activities?
We do not. We condemn terrorism in all its forms by whoever practices it for whatever reason, in whatever way. We have been a victim of terrorism. We know what it means. We have thousands of deaths and people have been mutilated and damaged to our country as a victim of terrorism. So we condemn it. We are very active, cooperating in all the international forms, and we have signed any international instrument linked to terrorism.
Was a reason given for the appearance of Cuba on the terrorist list, and was a goalpost set for how to get off of it?
Yes, it was because Cuba had in Cuba a group of representatives of the ELN, which is a guerrilla group for Colombia, that were in Cuba upon a request of the Colombian government for peace cooperation. And on the basis of protocols that needed to be met, Cuba was a grantor of that process, so we had to respect them. When the government of Colombia decided to suspend the dialogues, they demanded for those people to be returned. We said there are international protocols that we signed that we cannot go back on them. We received the support of Norway as a partner in dialogue, of anyone who participated in the process, supported Cuba's position. And thanks to that position, the new government of Colombia reintroduced the dialogue, and they're going on now, thanks to Cuba's position. The Colombian government has requested, the European Union has requested, all of the governments of Latin America and the Caribbean have requested the U.S. government to take Cuba out of that list. And yet, because the excuse that was used was proven false, yet we continue to be there, and there's no excuse today of why we're there.
How does that further limit things beyond what they were already limited?
It has a huge impact in Cuban economic activity in every country around the world. Because no bank institution, no financial institution would like to be accused of cooperating with a country that is in the list of allegedly sponsoring terrorism. That would have for them an impact in the U.S. economy, or the threat of having an impact. And that has because the list is totally arbitrary and has no legitimacy. But the U.S. economy has a huge impact around the world. It has a capacity to threaten and to punish, and others don't want to run that risk.
Hey, Prime members, have you heard? You can listen to your favorite podcasts ad-free? Good news! With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app for free or go to amazon.com/ad-free podcast. That's amazon.com/ad-free podcast to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Behind the bright lights and adrenaline of pro sports is an equally exciting world of negotiations and deal-making.
That's what we cover each week on our podcast, The Deal.
I'm Alex Rodriguez, former baseball player turned business executive.
And I'm Jason Kelly, chief correspondent for Bloomberg Originals. Over the next couple months, we'll hear from all-stars like Jay Williams.
I want to be an owner one day.
Billie Jean King.
Learn the business.
And so many more.
Listen to The Deal wherever you get your podcast.
Democrats and Republicans alike have joined to criticize Cuba on a number of fronts, including alleged human rights abuses. One example they give is the July 11th protests. They say there are still many people imprisoned unjustifiably.
It is difficult to gauge how many people went out on the street to protest that day. Some say 15, 20, let's say 25,000. Most of them did it peacefully. A small group. maybe about 1,000 practicing vandalism, violence, inciting violence, attacking police stations, burning cars. Those were prosecuted. Most of them went to jail. Not all, most of them went to jail because some received other type of sanctions. Of those, perhaps about half have already been released. But it is not true to claim that people were put in prison because they went peacefully out to protest or because of the way they thought. Because the great majority of those never saw a policeman, were never interrogated, never saw a police station. It is a claim used to try to punish Cuba and to justify actions against Cuba. Some of them remain in prison because the sentence have gone through. But in the US, on January 6th, many people went to protest in the United States. I would suspect the great majority of them peacefully. They were protesting the government. And many have been prosecuted. Some have been sent to jail. Some with sentences as large as 18 years without any violence or critical violence being committed. So why does the United States feel it has the authority to condemn Cuba and not look inside what is happening in the United States?
And then on the issue, I have just a couple more questions. And then if you want to add anything I didn't touch upon, you can add it. In the news in the United States, there is a lot about China and concerns and allegations that China has already been operating some sort of base or surveillance operation out of Cuba and plans to have some sort of larger operation out of Cuba. Is that true?
That came out in a story that was published by the Wall Street Journal and that has been repeated. No evidence has been put in place.
I mean, no evidence, but is it true?
It is totally untrue. We've told the U.S. government, we've spoken with them. We said more. We said that Cuba is a country under aggression from the United States, that we have the right to defend ourselves, that we have the right to establish defense cooperation with other governments, and we don't have to give excuses for that. Now, that being understood, what has been proclaimed, and then it's totally untrue. It's a fabrication, again, as others that have happened, the many that have happened in history, to try to make it impossible for there to be progress in the relationship between our two governments.
Aside from a defense cooperation or a supposed spy base of some kind or military base, is there increasing cooperation between Cuba and China? China has really made a lot of inroads in many countries where the United States has perhaps stepped back economically and China has come in and provided infrastructure help and all kinds of things. Is that happening in Cuba as well?
It's happening perhaps in a lesser level than other countries in Latin America, but it's a good relationship. Most of our relationship is trade. We buy a lot of products for industry in China. If we couldn't buy them in the United States, it's much closer and perhaps cheaper. But the U.S. laws prohibit it. We have to buy a lot in China. They give us financing, and they have invested in some infrastructure, for example, in an important plant for edition, for news edition and printing, in I think in the rail, in some industries. But it's a normal relationship, as we've had with Canada, as we've had with European countries, as we would have it with the United States if it were to be possible. I just say Cuba is not a threat to the United States. Cuba is not by far an enemy of the United States. There's no animosity. You can walk the streets of Cuba, talk with our people. And in spite of the difficult relationship, despite of the hostility that we have suffered for many years, you will not find animosity or ill feeling from the people of Cuba to Americans. Our two countries could have a respectful relationship in spite of our differences. And I would think it would be beneficial for Cuba without a doubt. And we think it would be beneficial for Americans too.
What do you think when you watch what you know of what's going on in America? What are your reflections today?
I would think with my mindset in Cuba, I am very concerned with the lack of information that Americans receive about Cuba, how much distorted information they receive, what's being packaged toward them. And I think that there's a level of contempt in the capacity of U.S. public opinion in interpreting by themselves. And that is a huge concern for us. It's difficult for us to overcome that barrier. And sometimes I see in the U.S. a society that is polarization and violence is increasing. And a lot has to do, in my opinion, but this is a personal opinion, with the increased concentration of wealth in just 1 or 2% of Americans that has grown dramatically since 1980 until today. And that's a huge problem that will have consequences socially, politically, in different terms.
Americans will hear you say one thing and the United States government say something else. What are they to make of the two entirely different pictures being portrayed?
They would have to look at it for themselves. Cubans are not prohibited to travel to the U.S. Americans are prohibited to travel to Cuba. Americans should ask their government to allow them to freely travel to Cuba and allow them for themselves to judge reality, not to have to ask for permission to see if it's granted or run the risk of being punished for exercising the wish to visit another country and learn by themselves.
That was Carlos Fernando de Cossio, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, who I met with on a recent trip to Cuba. We waited a couple of years for the visa to be issued from Cuba. As a journalist doing work there, you have to have their permission to come in and do news stories. We finally got it. The United States does not allow tourists to visit Cuba openly. Cuba allows it, but it's forbidden by the United States under the current rules. If you'd like to see my full report on Cuba post-Castro and some of the color and flavor that we saw and experienced, you can watch Full Measure on a TV station near you on Sunday, November 19th. For a station list, go to SharylAttkisson.com and click the Full Measure page. Or if you don't have a station near you, you can always go to fullmeasure.news online, fullmeasure.news, and about 9:32 Eastern Time, the program will be posted there and replays anytime. So let's say Sunday night you'll remember this, or you're listening to this some days later, you can still go to fullmeasure.news and watch the Cuba story. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast, and that if you did, you'll leave a great review, subscribe to this podcast, and share it with your friends. And if you like this sort of material, check out my other podcast, the Sharyl Attkisson Podcast. The holidays will be here before you know it, and I have a great way that you can support independent journalism and find cool gifts for independent thinkers like you. Go to SharylAttkisson.com and click on the Store tab. You'll see products with clever slogans that show people where you stand, such as, I need to find some new conspiracy theories. All my old ones came true. And do your own research, make up your own mind, think for yourself.